Now, there was a bag she carried, a nurse's bag, worn soft at the handles from the weight of everything she had ever set inside it. One night, in a walk up on the Lower East Side, she climbed the stairs with it, the way she had climbed 100 staircases before, and when the night was over, she threw that bag into the corner of the room, and she did not pick it up again. You see, something had ended in that apartment, on those stairs, in the small hours before dawn, and something else, something that would reach further than she could have known, had just begun. Here's what you have to understand about the woman climbing those stairs. She was a nurse, 32 years old, with strong hands and a quiet, watchful face. She moved through the tenements of New York, the way water moves through cracks, into the places no one else wanted to go. The smell of those buildings stayed in her clothes long after she left them, coal smoke and boiled cabbage, and the sour damp of too many people into little air. She did not flinch from it. She had learned, by then, not to flinch from much of anything. Her name was Margaret Sanger, though she had been born Margaret Higgins, in a crowded little house in Corning, New York, in the autumn of 1879. And to understand what happened on that staircase, you have to go back there first, to that house, to the woman who raised her. Because the thing that Margaret would spend her whole life fighting, she learned about first at her own mother's side, in a kitchen that never seemed to grow any warmer, no matter how many bodies filled it. Her mother was Anne Higgins, a woman with a soft Irish voice, and a cough that never fully left her. Anne had been pregnant, over the course of her marriage, 18 times. 11 of those children lived. Margaret was the 6th. Picture that kitchen, then, the constant motion of it. The older girls minding the younger ones, the pot always on the stove. The mother moving slower each year, her frame growing thinner, even as the family grew larger. Margaret watched her mother fade. That was the fact of her childhood, threaded quietly beneath the games and the chores, and the ordinary noise of a house full of children. Anne's body was being spent, and everyone could see it, and no one could name it, and no one could stop it. When Margaret was 19, her mother died, 50 years old, and a young woman standing at that graveside began, without quite the words for it yet, to do a terrible arithmetic in her head, counting the pregnancies against the years, against the coughing, against the slow disappearing of the strongest woman she had ever known. Now, there was a father in that house too, and he was a different kind of force altogether. Michael Higgins was a stonecutter, a man who carved angels and headstones for the dead, and argued about politics with anyone who would sit still long enough. He was a freethinker, a socialist, an agnostic in a town of quiet churchgoers, and he raised his daughters to ask questions that made the neighbors uneasy. From him, Margaret got her stubbornness, her willingness to stand alone. From her mother, she got the wound. And a life, sometimes, is what happens when a wound and a stubbornness meet in the same person. She left Corning as soon as she could. There was schooling, paid for by her older sisters, who had gone out to work so that Margaret might have more than they did. There was nursing training at a hospital in White Plains, the starched aprons, the long wards, the learning of how body fails and how, sometimes, it can be coaxed back. And there was a young architect named William Sanger, with dark eyes and an artist's restlessness, who married her in 1902, and gave her his name, the name the world would come to know. For a while, it looked like an ordinary life. A house in the suburbs, north of the city, in a green and quiet place called Hastings-on-Hudson. 3 children, in time. A husband who painted in the evenings. Margaret kept a garden and mended clothes and lived, for a few years, the life that a young woman of her time was supposed to want. But there was a restlessness in her that the garden could not settle, and in 1911, when a fire burned that suburban house to its foundations, it was almost as if the world had cleared its throat and told her the quiet years were over. So they came to the city. The Sangers packed what the fire had left them and moved into Manhattan, into the loud, electric heart of it. And here's the thing about New York in those years. It was a city arguing with itself, out loud, on every corner, down in Greenwich Village. In smoke-filled rooms, the painters and the poets and the radicals gathered to remake the world over cheap wine and long nights. Margaret and William slipped into that world easily, and Margaret, especially, found that the talk there lit something in her that the suburbs had let go cold. She met them all, the labor organizers, the anarchists, the writers with ink on their fingers and revolution in their mouths. There was Emma Goldman, fierce and unafraid, who spoke of things respectable people did not speak of. There was a whole circle of them, and Margaret sat in those rooms and listened, and slowly the listening turned into something else. She began to think that the questions her father had taught her to ask might have answers worth fighting for, and she began, in the daylight hours, to go back to nursing. But not the nursing of the quiet suburb. She took cases on the Lower East Side, in the immigrant tenements where the poorest of the poor were packed together, family upon family, floor upon floor. Here's what you have to understand about that place. A single block might hold more people than a whole village back in the old country. The stairways were dark. The air was thick. And the women in those apartments were doing something Margaret recognized, something she had watched her own mother do, year after year, until it killed her. They were having child after child after child, with nothing, no knowledge, no means, to stop it. She saw it up close now, not as a daughter, but as a nurse with a bag in her hand. She saw women worn to nothing by their 6th and 7th and 8th pregnancies. She saw the ones who could not feed the children they already had, and she saw, again and again, the thing that would come to haunt her most of all, the women who, desperate and out of options, tried to end their pregnancies themselves, with knitting needles, with poisons, with whatever a frightened woman could find. And she saw what it did to them. They would ask her, these women, in whispers, when the doctor had gone, "How do I stop this? How do I keep from having another?" And Margaret, who knew the law as well as anyone, had to tell them she could not say, because it was against the law to say. There was a federal statute, the Comstock Act, that made it a crime to send information about contraception through the mail, a crime to speak it, a crime to write it down. The knowledge these women were begging for had been locked away by men who would never need it. Now, she went looking, once. She went to the public libraries of New York City, a trained nurse, and she searched the shelves for anything, any book, any pamphlet, that might tell a woman how to keep from conceiving. And here's the part most people forget. She found nothing. In all the great libraries of the greatest city in the country, there was nothing a poor woman could use. The silence was not an accident. The silence was the law, doing exactly what it had been written to do. Picture her, then, riding the streetcars home from those calls in the evenings, past the lit shop windows, the bag heavy on her knees. She was carrying two things by now. She was carrying the medical knowledge to help a woman through a difficult birth, and she was carrying a growing, quiet fury at how little she was permitted to do to keep that difficult birth from being the woman's 8th or 9th, or last. The fury did not show on her face. She had her mother's cough somewhere in her memory, and she was learning to keep her own counsel. There was one summer that changed everything. It was the summer of 1912, and Margaret was called to an apartment in the sweltering heat of July, to a young woman named Sadie Sachs. Now, whether every detail of this story happened exactly as Margaret told it in the years after, we cannot fully know. An honest telling requires that we say so. But this was the story she carried with her for the rest of her life, and she told it again and again, and so we tell it here the way she did. Sadie was married to a truck driver named Jake. They had 3 children and very little money, and Sadie had tried to end a 4th pregnancy herself, the only way she knew how. When Margaret arrived, Sadie was gravely ill, burning with the fever of an infection that had spread through her blood. For weeks Margaret nursed her, in that hot little apartment, sponging her down, sitting through the long nights. And slowly, against the odds, Sadie began to recover. When the worst had passed, Sadie asked the doctor a question. She was frightened, you understand, of it all happening again. She asked him how she could keep from getting pregnant. And the doctor, a busy man, tired, laughed a little, and gave her the only answer men like him gave in those days. Tell Jake to sleep on the roof, he said, as though it were a joke. As though a poor woman's terror were a thing to be waved away with a joke. In the doorway, on his way out, Margaret watched Sadie's face when the doctor said it, and she understood that there was no help coming, not from him, not from anyone who could have given it. She packed her own bag and left, and she told herself she would find the answer, somehow, when she had the time. But the summer wore on, and the calls came, and she did not go back. That was the thing she could never quite forgive herself for. She did not go back. 3 months later, the telephone rang. It was Jake. Sadie had tried again, the same desperate way, and this time there would be no recovery. By the time Margaret climbed those stairs, Sadie was already sinking, her skin gone gray, her breath shallow. She died within minutes of Margaret reaching her side. 10 minutes, no more. A young mother of 3, gone in a hot room while her husband stood against the wall with his hands hanging useless at his sides. and this is the night. This is the staircase from the very beginning of our story. Margaret walked down those stairs into the gray light before dawn, out into the sleeping city, she wrote. Years later, that she walked the streets for hours, unable to go home, and that as the sun came up over the rooftops she made a kind of vow to herself. She would throw the nursing bag into the corner. She was done treating the symptom. She was going after the cause. I threw my nursing bag in the corner, she wrote, and announced that I would never take another case until I had made it possible for working women in America to have the knowledge to control birth. Now, those may not have been the exact words she spoke that night, to the empty room, in the dark. But they were the shape of the decision, and once a decision like that is made, in a person built the way Margaret was built, it does not come undone. So the nurse became something else. She began to write, not private letters, not careful notes, but columns in a socialist newspaper called the New York Call, plain talk for women about their own bodies, in an age when such talk was scandalous. What Every Girl Should Know, she titled one series. And here's where the story turns, because the men who enforced the Comstock Act were watching the newspapers too, and they did not care for a nurse who put the truth in print where any girl might read it. One of her columns was set to run on a Sunday, a piece about the diseases that could pass between a husband and a wife, and the postal authorities, acting on the anti-vice laws, forbade it. When the readers opened the New York Call that day, they found where the column should have been an empty space, and inside the empty space, a single line. What every girl should know, it read. Nothing. By order of the Post Office Department. Margaret had turned the censorship itself into the headline. It was a small thing, that blank column, that little act of defiance printed in the white space of a newspaper, but it taught her something she would use for the rest of her life. The men who wanted her silent were, without meaning to, making her loud. Every time they gagged her, the gag became the story. She was learning, at the dawn of her fight, that a wall thrown up in public can teach a crowd exactly what the builders were trying to hide. Now, in 1913, the marriage began to come apart. William was a good man in his way, but Margaret was becoming something he had not married. Something larger and harder and more singular, and the two of them could no longer share a single roof and a single life. They separated. It was not a clean break, and it would not be finished for years, but the woman who walked forward from it walked, more and more, alone. The cause was becoming the thing she was married to now. She went abroad. She sailed to England and to France, and everywhere she went she carried her questions, and slowly she began to find answers that America had hidden from her. In the cities of Europe she met the thinkers who had studied these matters openly, without shame, and she saw that other countries were not so frightened of the truth. She was gathering ammunition, you might say. She was building, piece by piece, the knowledge she had promised those women she would find. And there was a word she was looking for, a plain word, an honest word, for the thing she meant to fight for. The doctors used cold Latin. The reformers used soft phrases, family limitation, and the like. Phrases that hid as much as they revealed. Margaret wanted a word that a woman on the Lower East Side could say out loud, could understand, could claim. Sitting with a few fellow activists, turning the language over, she and her circle settled onto words that would ring through the whole century after. Birth control. That was the phrase. Birth control, simple and direct, to words a tired mother could hold in her hand. It seems ordinary to us now, worn smooth by 100 years of use. But when Margaret and her friends chose it, it was brand new. A small invention of language. And like most powerful things, it was powerful because it was clear. Once a thing has a name, people can ask for it. Once people can ask for it, the silence that hid it begins, at last, to break. In the spring of 1914, she launched her own paper. She called it The Woman Rebel, 8 small pages, printed defiantly, and across the top she ran a slogan borrowed from the radicals she had come up among: no gods, no masters. Now, the paper itself was raw and fierce, and not always careful. But that was the point. She meant to provoke. She meant to make the Comstock Act show its face, to force the law that hid in the shadows out into the open, where the whole country could look at it, and the law took the bait. The post office declared issue after issue unmailable, seizing them, blocking them, and in the late summer of that year the government indicted her. The charges were serious. If convicted, Margaret faced years in a federal prison, her children left without their mother. Her fight ended before it had truly begun. Here was the cost. laid out plainly. This was no longer columns and clever blank spaces. This was the machinery of the state, turning its full weight toward one stubborn nurse. Before the trial, she did something reckless and brave. She wrote a pamphlet, 16 pages, and she called it Family Limitation, and in it, in plain language, she set down the actual methods, the real, practical knowledge a woman could use. It was the very thing the law forbade most of all. No respectable printer would touch it. She finally found a socialist who agreed to run it off in secret. At night, with the doors locked, 100,000 copies of that first printing went out into the hands of women who had waited their whole lives for it. Then, facing prison, she ran. On the eve of her trial, with forged travel papers arranged by friends, Margaret boarded a ship under a false name and fled across the Atlantic to England. It was a hard choice, and it looked, to some, like cowardice. But she had calculated it coldly. In prison she could do nothing. Free, even in exile, she could learn, and write, and wait for the moment when the country might be ready to hear her. She left her children behind. That was the price, and she paid it. And it cost her more than she ever fully said. In England she worked and studied, but the ocean could not protect her from everything. Word reached her, in the autumn of 1915, that support for her cause was rising back home, and she decided to return and stand trial after all. And then, before she could face any courtroom, the thing happened that no arithmetic and no cause could soften. Her little daughter, Peggy, 5 years old, the child she had left behind, fell sick with pneumonia, and this time Margaret got home too late for anything but grief. Peggy died in November, 5 years old. Margaret, who had watched a stranger named Sadie die in a hot apartment, who had watched her own mother die by inches, now sat with the still, small body of her own daughter, and there was no cause in the world large enough to fill the hole it left. She almost never spoke of it afterward. The people who knew her said that some light in her dimmed that winter and never came fully back. What a mother feels in that room is not for the record to say. She carried the small empty coat of it for the rest of her life. The trial came in the shadow of that grief. And here is a strange turn of the story. The government, which had chased her across an ocean, now did not want her. The prosecutor looked at this woman, freshly bereaved of her child, admired now by growing crowds, and he understood that to convict her would be to hand her a pulpit. A martyr was the last thing the law wanted. And so, quietly, without fanfare, the charges were dropped. Margaret walked out free, and she walked out more dangerous to them than she had ever been. She had learned, by now, every lesson the fight could teach her from a distance. She had the word, birth control. She had the audience, larger, every month. She had the knowledge she had gone to Europe to gather, and in Holland she had seen a thing that changed her mind about how the fight must be waged. She had seen clinics, real clinics, staffed by trained women, where a poor mother could walk in off the street, and be given not a lecture, not a pamphlet, but actual help, in her own hands, to take home. And Margaret thought, why not here? Why not now? Now, understand what she was proposing to do. Everything she had done so far had been words, columns and pamphlets and papers, and words, however dangerous, were only words. A clinic was different. A clinic was an act. To open a clinic and hand a woman a contraceptive device was to break the Comstock Act in the flesh. In the open, in a storefront with her name on the door, there would be no clever blank space to hide behind. There would be only the deed and the arrest that everyone knew must follow it. She chose Brownsville, a poor neighborhood deep in Brooklyn, block after block of tenements full of immigrant families, exactly the kind of women she had promised to serve. She found a storefront on Amboy Street, cheap and plain, with 2 small rooms. She could not find a single doctor in all of New York brave enough to work there, so she turned to her own sister, Ethel Byrne, a nurse like herself, and she printed handbills in English and Yiddish and Italian. Mothers, they read, can you afford to have a large family? Do not kill. Do not take life, but prevent. On the morning of October the 16th, 1916, they opened the doors. And here's the thing about that morning. Margaret half expected no one to come. But when she looked out into the gray Brooklyn dawn, there was a line. Women stood along the sidewalk with their shawls pulled close and their babies on their hips, some of them having walked for miles, some of them having waited outside since before light. The line stretched down the block and around the corner. They had been waiting, all of them, their whole lives, for a door like this one to open. For 9 days, it stayed open. 9 days. Women came by the hundreds, and the nurses sat with them, one by one, and told them the plain truth about their own bodies and sent them home with knowledge and with the means to use it. Margaret kept careful records, the names, the ages, the number of children already born, the number already buried. Behind each line in that ledger was a face, tired, hopeful, disbelieving that such a place could exist. For 9 days, in a storefront in Brooklyn, the silence that had ruled these women's lives was finally, quietly broken. Then, on the 9th day, a well-dressed woman came in who was not what she seemed. She paid her fee, she took her information, and she came back the next day with the police behind her. She had been a decoy, sent by the vice squad. The officers seized the records, the supplies, the furniture, and they arrested Margaret and led her out through the crowd of waiting mothers. And here's the part most people forget. Even as they were shutting the doors, the women in that line did not scatter. They followed the patrol wagon down the street, on foot, crying out after her. She bailed out and went straight back and opened the doors again, because that was who she was. So they arrested her a second time. They forced the landlord to evict her, and the little clinic on Amboy Street was finished 1 month after it had begun. But the thing it had started could not be evicted. The newspapers had the story now. Across the country, women read about the clinic in Brooklyn, and about the nurse who had gone to jail for opening it, and something in them stirred, and turned, and began to move. The trial of the sisters came in the winter. Ethel was tried first, convicted, and sent to a workhouse for 30 days. And in that workhouse, Ethel did something that shocked the nation. She refused to eat. A hunger strike. The first by a woman prisoner in America, and when she grew weak, they held her down and fed her by force, through a tube, day after day. The papers carried every detail. A woman was being force-fed in an American jail for the crime of telling other women how to plan their families, and the country could not look away. Margaret was terrified for her sister's life. Ethel was failing fast, and at last Margaret made a bargain to save her, a promise that Ethel would not break the law again, and on that promise her sister was pardoned and carried out half-conscious. Then it was Margaret's own turn before the judge, who offered her the same deal he offered so many. Promise to obey the law from now on, he said, and I will be lenient. But standing there in the courtroom, she looked at him, and said the thing that people would remember. I cannot respect the law as it exists today. She chose the workhouse over the fine, 30 days behind bars, rather than bend a single inch. And behind those bars she did what she always did. She taught the other women, the poor and the fallen, the very knowledge that had put her there, whispering it through the long institutional nights. Now, going to jail is a defeat, on the face of it. But Margaret had a way of turning defeats inside out. While she sat in that workhouse, her lawyers took her case up through the courts, and in 1918, a judge on New York's highest court handed down a ruling that cracked the wall wide open. Doctors, he said, could lawfully prescribe contraception to protect a woman's health. It was not everything, but it was a door, a real legal door, and Margaret understood at once how to walk through it. Here's what you have to understand about the years that followed. Margaret stopped being only a rebel and started becoming a builder. If doctors could legally prescribe, then she would build clinics with doctors in them, lawful clinics that could hand a woman what she needed without a policeman at the door. In 1923 she opened one in New York, staffed entirely by women, doctors and nurses and social workers, and it saw thousands of patients a year. The storefront that had lasted 9 days had become an institution that would outlast her. She wrote a book in those years, Woman and the New Race, and it sold hundreds of thousands of copies. And in it she set down the belief that ran under everything she did. No woman can call herself free, she wrote, who does not own and control her own body. It was a plain sentence, but it landed in the lives of women who had never once been told that their bodies were their own, and it landed the way a key lands in a lock, and for many of them something turned that had been stuck their whole lives. She built a machine for the cause, tireless and relentless. She founded leagues and committees, she raised money from wealthy donors, she crossed the country by train to give speeches in cities that had never heard such things said aloud. She lectured to workers and to churchmen, to socialites and to scientists, to anyone who would fill a hall and listen. She would speak, she said, to any group at all, if it moved the cause forward, and the halls filled, city after city, year after year. The opposition filled too. The Catholic Church, powerful and organized, set itself squarely against her, and in city after city, the doors began to close. Officials banned her from speaking. Hotels were pressured to cancel her events. In Boston, in 1929, The authorities threatened to arrest her the moment she opened her mouth on a public stage. And so Margaret, who had learned long ago how to turn a gag into a headline, walked out onto that stage and did something no one expected. She stood before the crowd in perfect silence. Across her mouth she had tied a cloth, a gag, and she would not say a word. Beside her, a professor from Harvard read aloud the speech she was forbidden to give. "I have been gagged," the words said, in her voice through his. "I have been suppressed. I have been arrested numerous times. And yet every time, more people have listened, more have protested, more have lifted up their own voices." The silence in that hall was louder than any speech she could have given. Now, this is a part of the story that honesty requires us to walk through carefully, and not around. In the years of her building, Margaret tied her cause to the eugenics movement, which was fashionable and respectable in the America of the 1920s, embraced by scientists and universities and the wealthy. She used its language, she argued, at times, in its cold and troubling terms. Historians still debate how deeply she believed it and how much she simply used it to win allies for birth control. But the words are on the record, and they are hers, and we do not scrub them away. What can be said, and said fairly, is this: her clinics served women of every race and religion, and she would not tolerate bigotry among her staff, and she opened a clinic in Harlem, supported by black doctors and nurses and an advisory board of the community's own leaders, praised by the great scholar, W.E.B. Du Bois. She was a woman of her age, carrying both its aspirations and its blindnesses, and the fullest telling holds both of those truths in the same hand, without letting go of either. Through the 1920s and 30s she pressed on, clinic by clinic, city by city, Chicago and Los Angeles and Detroit and Baltimore, a network spreading across the map like roots under a field. And she remarried, in 1922, a businessman named Noah Slee, who loved her and quietly poured his fortune into her cause, even smuggling contraceptive devices across the border hidden in his company's cargo. She had found, late, a partner who did not need her to be smaller than she was. But the law, the old Comstock law, still stood over all of it, a shadow across every clinic door, and Margaret, ever the strategist, decided the time had come to attack it head-on, in the one place that could truly break it: the courts. She arranged, deliberately, for a package of contraceptive devices to be shipped to a doctor from Japan, knowing the government would seize it, knowing the seizure would force a case, knowing that a case, argued right, might at last topple the statute that had ruled her whole life's fight. The government seized the package, exactly as she knew it would, and the case wound its way up through the courts, year by year, until in 1936 the judges handed down their ruling. Doctors, the court said, could receive and prescribe contraceptives, and the Comstock Act could no longer stand in their way. It was the victory she had been walking towards since the night on the Brooklyn staircase, since the blank column in the newspaper, since the storefront on Amboy Street. The wall her whole life had pressed against, at last, gave way. The following year the American Medical Association, the great cautious body of the doctors themselves, formally recognized birth control as a proper part of medicine. Think of what that meant. The knowledge that could not be found in any library in 1912, the knowledge a dying woman had begged for in a hot apartment, was now to be taught in the medical schools, handed down doctor to doctor, as ordinary, and as accepted as setting a bone. The thing she had thrown her nursing bag into a corner to fight for had become, simply, medicine. And still she was not finished. The movement she had built kept growing beyond her, and in 1942, over her own objection, her organizations merged and took a new name she did not like, a name she thought too soft, too polite for the fight it had been. Planned Parenthood. She grumbled at it, but the thing itself, the network of clinics, the trained doctors, the open doors, went on serving hundreds of thousands of women, and the name, in time, would become one of the most known in America. There is a photograph from those middle years of a woman no longer young, small and composed, with careful hair and steady eyes, seated among the boards and committees she had willed into being. She had come a long way from the tenement stairs, and yet the people close to her said that the fire of the early days had banked down into something quieter, that after Peggy, after the years of jail and exile and loss, she guarded herself, and that the public woman and the private one were not always the same person. She had spent a great deal to get here. She did not always let it show. Now here is where the story asks us to slow down. because we have come to the choice that mattered most, made when she was already old. In the early 1950s, Margaret was in her 70s, her health failing, the great battle seemingly behind her. She could have rested. No one would have blamed her. But there was one thing she had wanted since the very beginning. One thing that had never yet existed in all the world, and she was not ready to leave the field without reaching for it. She wanted a pill. A simple thing, she imagined, something a woman could take on her own, without a doctor's fitting, without a device, without her husband's knowledge or permission. A thing entirely within her own control. It was, in 1950, closer to a dream than a plan. No such thing existed. The science was uncertain, the money was scarce, and Margaret was an old woman with a weak heart, and no laboratory of her own. What she had was the thing she had always had. She knew how to find people, and she knew how to make them move. She found a scientist first, a biologist named Gregory Pincus, who believed the thing might actually be possible, and then she did what she had done her whole life. She went looking for the money to make it real. She turned to an old friend and ally, Catherine McCormick, a woman of enormous fortune and fierce conviction, and she made her case, one aging woman to another, that they had it in their power to finish what Margaret had started 40 years before. Picture the two of them, then. Two women in their 70s, one with the money and one with the fire, deciding between them to fund a piece of science that could change the lives of every woman who came after. McCormick wrote the checks, enormous ones. Quietly, year after year, Pincus and his colleagues did the work in their laboratories, and Margaret, too frail now to march or to lecture, watched from the sidelines and pushed the way she had always pushed, refusing to let the thing lose momentum, refusing to let it die. The work was slow, and it was hard, and there were failures, and there were long stretches when it seemed it might come to nothing. But it did not come to nothing. By the end of the decade, the pill was real. It worked. A woman could take it, and it was hers alone. The very thing Margaret had dreamed of in 1950, the very freedom she had promised those women on the Lower East Side, half a century before, when she was young, and the world had told her it could not be done. Pincus said, afterward, that without Margaret Sanger, there would have been no pill. She had not held the test tubes. She had not written the equations. But she had done the thing she was born to do, the thing she had done at every turning of her long life. She had seen a door that did not yet exist, and she had refused to accept that it could not be built, and she had gathered the people and the will and the money to build it. And then she had stood back and let it swing open for women she would never meet. In the years that followed, the world began, slowly, to hand her the honors it had once denied her. She had been arrested 8 times in her life. Now universities gave her degrees, and committees gave her medals, and she was nominated, again and again, for the Nobel Peace Prize. Japan, a country she had visited and loved, gave her a high decoration for the good she had done there. The nurse who could not find a single doctor to stand beside her in Brownsville had become, at the last, a figure the whole world knew. But time takes its toll as it takes it from everyone, and Margaret's did not spare her. Her heart weakened. Her memory began to blur and drift. In her early 80s, she moved into a convalescent home in Tucson, Arizona, the desert town where she had spent her later winters, and the fierce, driving woman of the tenement stairs grew quiet and small in a sunlit room far from the crowded city where it had all begun. She had, by then, largely stepped back from the fight. The fight, at last, could go on without her. And then, in the last full year of her life, something happened that must have reached her even through the fog of her final illness. In 1965, the Supreme Court of the United States, in a case called Griswold against Connecticut, struck down the last laws that forbade married couples the right to birth control, the thing she had gone to jail for, the thing that had been illegal her entire adult life. It was, at the highest level of the land, finally, and fully lawful. She had lived, just barely, to see it. Here's the part that catches in the throat. The woman at the center of that final case, the head of the Connecticut clinic whose arrest had forced it, ran a Planned Parenthood, one of the descendants of the little storefront on Amboy Street. The movement Margaret had started with 8 pages and a stubborn heart had grown so large, so woven into the country, that it reached all the way up to the highest court, and won there, in her own lifetime, while she still breathed. The seed had become the forest. Now, we should be honest about what those last years were like, and not gild them. She was frail, and often confused, and the woman who had once electrified crowded halls now spent long quiet days in a single room. The great fire had not gone out, but it had burned down low, the way a fire does at the end of a long, long night. She had outlived her second husband by more than 20 years. She had outlived, most painfully of all, her small daughter, for nearly half a century, and she waited, in the desert, for the thing that comes for everyone. It came on the 6th of September, in 1966, 8 days short of her 87th birthday. Her heart, worn out at last by 86 years of driving her forward, simply stopped. She died in the convalescent home in Tucson, in the dry, bright desert air, far from the coal smoke and boiled cabbage of the tenements where her real life's work had begun. Outside her window, the Arizona light lay flat and gold across the mountains. Inside it, the long fight was finally, quietly over. They held her funeral in a small Episcopal church in Tucson, and a month later a memorial service in Manhattan, in the city that had made her and jailed her, and been remade, in part, by her. And then they took her home, in a manner of speaking. They buried her in Fishkill, New York, in the state where she had been born, laid to rest beside her sister and her second husband, Nan, the sister who had gone out to work so young Margaret could have her schooling. The circle, in the ground, closing. Here's what you have to understand about what she left behind. It was not a monument you could point to, not a single building, not a law with her name across the top. It was something quieter and larger than that. It was the ordinary, everyday freedom of women to decide, for themselves, whether and when to become mothers. A freedom so woven into the world now that the women who use it rarely think of the name of the woman who fought for it, who went to jail for it, who threw her nursing bag into a corner, and never picked it up again. Now, the honest teller cannot leave you with only the light. Margaret Sanger was a complicated woman, and the century since has argued fiercely over her, and it argues still. Her entanglement with eugenics, her cold words in cold years, have been held up and condemned, some of it fairly, some of it twisted far past what the record shows. She has been made into a hero and made into a villain, and the truth, as it so often is, lies in the hard middle ground where a real human being actually stood. What is true is this: a young woman watched her mother die, worn out by too many births, and made of that grief a lifelong refusal. A nurse watched a stranger die in a hot apartment, and made of that guilt a vow she kept for 50 years. And whatever else she was, whatever flaws she carried, she moved something in the world that had seemed immovable. And because she moved it, the lives of countless women who never knew her name were made freer, and safer, and more their own. Picture, for a moment, the two ends of her life set side by side. At one end, a nurse climbing a dark tenement staircase with a heavy load, forbidden by law to answer the one question the dying woman upstairs most needed answered. At the other end, an old woman in a sunlit desert room, having lived to see that question answered, at last, all the way up to the highest court in the land. The distance between those two rooms is the distance she traveled. It took her whole life to cross it. She was not a saint, and she would not have wanted to be called one. She was stubborn and singular and sometimes hard, and she made real mistakes, and she paid real prices, some she chose, and some she never would have chosen. She lost a daughter. She lost a marriage. She spent nights in jail. She crossed an ocean under a false name, and left her children behind. The freedom she won for others, she won at a cost that was entirely her own. And she carried that cost quietly, the way she had learned to carry everything. No woman can call herself free, she had written, all those years before, in the middle of the fight, who does not own and control her own body. It was the sentence at the center of her whole life. She had said it when it was dangerous to say, when saying it could send you to prison, when the great institutions of church and state and medicine were arrayed against it, and she lived long enough to watch it stop being dangerous and start being simply, quietly, true. And here's the thing about a life like hers. The proof of it is not in the monuments or the medals or the arguments that still rage around her name. The proof of it is in the ordinary mourning of an ordinary woman, 100 years later, in a country Margaret never saw, making a choice about her own body and her own future, as easily as drawing a breath, never once thinking of the tenement stairs, the blank column, the workhouse, the desert room. The freedom outlived the fight. That was always the whole point. So when you think of her, do not think first of the controversies, though they are real, and do not think first of the honors, though she earned them. Think of the young nurse in 1912, walking down a Brooklyn staircase into the gray light before dawn. A woman just dead behind her and a whole life's work ahead, deciding, in the cold morning air, that she would never again treat the symptom while ignoring the cause. That decision held. She was 32 years old. Tired, grieving, ordinary in every way but one. She had made up her mind. And a decision like that, made by a person built the way she was built, does not come undone, not by prison, not by exile, not by the loss of a child, not by the weight of a whole country arrayed against her. It only bends the world, slowly, over 50 stubborn years, until the world is not quite the shape it was before. There was a line of women outside a storefront in Brooklyn once. On a gray October morning, shawls pulled close, babies on their hips, waiting for a door to open. That line is the truest picture of what she did. Not the courtrooms, not the headlines, not the arguments of historians. Just women, waiting for someone to finally answer the question they had been forbidden to ask. And a nurse from Corning, New York, who had buried her mother and would bury her daughter, opening the door and letting them in. The clinic lasted 9 days. But the door, once open, could not truly be closed again, no matter how many landlords were pressured, or how many arrests were made. Because the women had seen it. They had seen that such a place could exist, that such knowledge could be given, that the silence was not the natural order of things, but only a wall that men had built, and walls that men build. Other people can, in time, tear down. She had shown them the door. The rest they would carry forward themselves. It is a strange and moving thing, to trace a single life across so many years and see how far a person can carry a single idea. From a kitchen in Corning, where a mother slowly disappeared, to a tenement where a stranger died, to a Brooklyn storefront, a workhouse cell, a European exile, a courtroom, a laboratory, a desert room at the very end. One thread, held the whole way through, never once let go. That is not nothing. That, in fact, is close to everything a single human life can be. She would not want us to weep for her, this woman who never let anyone see her weep. She would want us to remember why she did it, not for herself, not for the honors that came too late, but for the tired woman on the stairs, the frightened woman in the hot apartment, the girl in the crowded kitchen watching her mother fade. For all the women who were never asked and never told and never free, she did it for them. And they, mostly, will never know her name. She made her peace with that a long time ago. In her later years, when reporters came asking about the great sweep of it, the arrests, the battles, the movement she had built, she did not much like to dwell on any of it. She had never called herself a hero, and she bristled a little when others did. What she remembered, what she came back to, again and again, was not the triumphs. It was the faces. The women in the tenements, the ones she had been too late to help, and the ones, at last, she was not. The staircase is gone now. The tenement is gone. The storefront on Amboy Street is gone. The workhouse, the courtrooms, the desert convalescent home, all of it swept away by the years. Margaret Sanger has been in the ground in Fishkill for a very long time. But the thing she opened is still open. It works, quietly, in 1,000 ordinary places, every single day. For women who will never know the weight of what she carried up those dark stairs, or the cost of what she set down. And perhaps that is the only monument she would have wanted. Not marble, not bronze, not her name carved anywhere at all. Just a woman walking freely into a life that is fully, finally, her own. That was the whole of it. That was what the nurse from Corning gave up the quiet years for, in the cold dawn of 1912, when she was young, and grieving, and had only just begun. There is a kind of person who spends a whole life carrying the memory of someone they could not save. Sadie Sachs, dead in a hot apartment before Margaret could reach her with the one thing she needed, and Higgins, worn to nothing in a crowded kitchen. Little Peggy, 5 years old, gone in a November that never fully left her mother's face. Margaret carried all of them, quietly, every day, and every door she opened, in some sense, she opened for them. You do not always get to save the ones you love. Sometimes you can only make sure the next ones are not lost the same way. And so she turned, in the gray light of that long ago dawn, and walked out into a city that did not yet know her name, into a fight that would take everything she had. She never looked back. She had somewhere else to be. There were doors, all across the country, all across the century, still waiting to be opened, and only so much time, and so much fire in one stubborn human heart to open them. She was, in the end, just a woman from Corning, New York, with her father's stubbornnness and her mother's wound and a promise she made to an empty room. That was all, and it was enough to change the world. The light comes flat and gold across the Arizona mountains, the way it did on her last morning, and somewhere far away a woman walks freely into a day that is her own, and does not think of Margaret Sanger at all, which is, when you understand it rightly, exactly the way she wanted it. If you have walked this whole way with me, from the crowded kitchen to the desert room, then you already know the shape of what she left us. It is not a thing you can hold. It is a thing you can only live inside, the way you live inside the air, hardly noticing it is there, a freedom so ordinary now that its ordinariness is the measure of how hard it was won. That is what one life can do, when it decides, in the cold before dawn, that it will not turn away. So remember the decision, if you remember nothing else. A tired nurse, in a poor apartment, in the first gray light of an ordinary morning, deciding that she was done treating the wound and would go, from now on, straight at the cause of it. Everything else, the whole long life, the prison and the exile and the honors and the loss, everything came from that one moment, that one small human act of refusing, ever again, to look away from what she had seen. There are lives that pass through the world and leave it much as they found it. And there are the other kind, the rare kind, that press against some fixed and immovable thing, year after year, until it moves. Margaret Sanger was the second kind. She pressed against a wall her whole life long, and she did not live to see all of what came after, the way the ground shifted, the way the door stayed open, but she felt it begin to give. In her last years, she felt the wall begin to move, and for a woman like that, that was very nearly enough. So this is where we leave her, not in the courtroom, not on the lecture stage, not in the pages of the history books, where the arguments still rage. We leave her on the staircase, young again, in the year 1912, with the whole impossible fight still ahead of her, and no idea, yet, of how much it would cost, or how much it would win. We leave her at the moment of the choice, which is where the truest part of any life always lives. She is turning toward the door, and the door, once she opens it, will never fully close again. That is the thing to carry away from all of this, not the dates, not the debates, not the marble and the medals, just a door, opened by a stubborn, grieving, imperfect woman, and held open by everyone who came after her, so that the women of a whole century could walk through it into lives that were finally, fully their own. She would not have asked for thanks. She would only have asked that it stay open. So far, it has. Her mother had 18 pregnancies and died at 50. Her daughter lived 5 years, and between those two losses, cradled between them her whole life long, Margaret Sanger built something that meant no other daughter, no other mother, need be lost in quite the same way, unasked, and told, and unfree. That was the arithmetic she had begun to do at 19. At a graveside in Corning. It took her the rest of her life to finish the sum, and the answer, when it came, was quieter than she could have imagined and larger than she ever dared hope. It was not a slogan, or a statute, or a monument. It was a young woman, somewhere, on an ordinary morning, holding her own future in her own two hands, free to choose it. That was the answer. That was what 50 stubborn years had purchased. And Margaret, worn out at 86 in a desert room, had lived just long enough to know that the sum, at last, had come out right. So the next time you pass an ordinary clinic on an ordinary street, or hear the ordinary name of Planned Parenthood, or simply move through a day in which a woman's body is understood to be her own, think, just for a moment, of the nurse who made it so. Think of the line of women outside the storefront, the shawls, the babies, the waiting, and think of how far one grieving, stubborn heart carried a single idea, across 50 years and a whole country, until it became so ordinary that we forgot it was ever anything else. If Margaret's story moved something in you today, I'd be so glad if you stayed a while with this channel, where we tell the lives of the people who quietly changed the world. Subscribing and leaving a like helps more listeners find these stories and the people inside them. And if you turn on notifications, you will not miss the next life we sit down with together. Until then, thank you for listening, and I will see you when the next door opens.